It's Melvin here. So, as in the last few years, I've been blogging and vlogging a lot around toxic families and families that could be described as unhealthy. And I've always kind of made the presumption that the broader public had an understanding of what family estrangement was and how family estrangement is a component of toxic families or a byproduct of it. And I suppose in the last few months, I've been talking to different groups and different individuals about my own research and my own work around family estrangement. And I'm getting more people asking me what exactly family estrangement is, and I suppose it is important to actually define or try and create some clarity on what exactly family estrangement is. So that's the purpose of this video. Feel free to give it a share if it's applicable to someone that you know. If you want to keep in touch on these videos, please subscribe to the channel. And in the new year, I'm going to be hosting seminars and support groups around people who are maybe struggling with family estrangement, who want a bit more support in that area. If you're interested, shoot me an email at carl@toxicescape.com. I'll add you to the main list, and I'll keep you up to date on what's happening in the new year. Okay, so the first question is, how do we define family estrangement? And I feel one of the reasons why society may not understand exactly what family estrangement is because there is no universal definition. If you were to read the research material available on this, almost every paper has its own definition of how they view family estrangement, and that's based on maybe the focus of their research, their own bias, or their own understanding of it. For me personally, just working in private practice, and I've worked with people who were estranged from family members for years now, is I always view it as a distancing process where one or more people within a family consciously decide to create space from one another to reduce stress. The conscious decision aspect of it is the most important there, because estrangement is very different from losing touch from somebody. Losing touch is circumstantial. It could be a product of somebody moving away, a change of life status, someone having kids, work, all the different aspects of life, which means they just don't have the time to invest in relationship. That isn't estrangement. Estrangement is when someone decides, I want to be away from this person for in whatever way away means, or whatever way distance means for them, because there's too much stress. And that could be the product of conflict, abuse, toxic behaviors, mismatch of expectations. Maybe the weight of expectations being placed on you just force you to decide to create that space. There's quite a few reasons why family estrangement happens within family. I'm going to address that in a separate video, but for now I want to read 4 different definitions from 4 different research papers, and it's interesting just to review this, and it may give you ideas, it may help you find clarity around your own estrangement. The first one comes from Richard Conti, and he's an American psychologist, and he describes it as a communication cut off between family members. Interesting definition. I like to emphasize the communication aspect of it. The use of the word cut off in communication suggests that there is no communication between family members who are estranged. From my experience, that isn't always true. I've seen families who they do actually spend time around each other, but they have very limited engagement. They only talk about specific topics. Maybe they're just being civil, but they're not being open. They're not sharing their private lives. They're just keeping it very, very simple and very basic. The second definition comes from Standalone, and they're an organisation based in the UK who commissioned their own research around family estrangement. It was in 2015, and they describe family estrangement as the breakdown of a supportive relationship between family members. Again, a very interesting definition. They emphasise the role that support plays in families and how that's lost after estrangement happens. I would argue that often that lack of support has existed in the family for years, and with my clients in particular, they take on a supportive capacity, and they take on a role of maybe a peacekeeper or whatever it is to try and help everyone else's problems, and so support may not have been there for them, and then they decide they've had enough, the stress is too great, and they instigate an estrangement. That's just one example. So the support isn't always there, but again, it is an interesting definition. The third one comes from Christina Scharp. She did research, I think it was 2014, in the role that communication plays in maintaining estrangement. It was for a PhD in communication studies. So her definition is an intentional, voluntary, communicative effort to gain distance from a negative relationship commonly taken for granted as undissolvable. Very interesting definition. Again, she emphasises the intentional and the voluntary piece. Obviously, because her background in communication studies, she looks at it as a communicative effort to create that distance. What's particularly interesting is how she references the taken for granted as undissolvable aspect of a family relationship, and that's quite true in society. The bond of blood and bond of family is often viewed as something that will never be broken. And I think that adds an added pressure on people who are stuck in families where there is huge amount of maybe abuse or toxic behaviours, and they view, because of how society views family, they feel like they're trapped and they can't move on. And again, my work for years now has been helping people find autonomy and pull back and actually make their own decisions about what's right for them, what's healthy for them, and maybe redefine who their family is. And maybe it isn't the family they were born into, maybe it's the people who they choose to spend time with. The last definition comes from Kylie Aglias, and she's an Australian social worker who has done extensive research around family estrangement, and I would be a big fan of her work. Her work has helped me massively. Her work in particular has focused on two perspectives. The perspective of the parent who may be estranged from one of their adult children, or multiple adult children, or the perspective of the adult children who are estranged from their parents. And it's great because it gives us both sides, both views of what's happening and how it could be affecting people. So she defines family estrangement as the physical distancing and loss of affection between family members, often due to intense conflict and ongoing disagreement. Physical distancing is interesting. She references that again. From my example, from my experiences, not every estrangement is physical. It could be emotional, in that there's people spend time around each other, but there's all these barriers that prevent a closeness. And if she does reference the lack of affection, or loss of affection, again, that's important, because again, two people could be in a relationship, they could see each other, but they're not close, they're not intimate, they're not sharing anything personal, they're not being even the expression of affection through hugs or anything else. That's completely gone. Again, interestingly, she references intense conflict and ongoing disagreement, again, leading to stress, which could be why people need all this distance in the first place, or they become estranged in the first place. Each definition is interesting. They all probably have their own limitations, including my own, and that's because it may not cover all the variables which make up family estrangement. And it is such a complex phenomenon that I don't even think it's possible to maybe find one universal definition that covers all the different bases. But for now, just reflect on these and maybe find one that you can relate to personally. Okay, I want to just talk about the three different basic perspectives that we kind of take when I explore family estrangement. So the first one is the perspective of a parent who is estranged from one of their adult children. Now, they may have chosen to estrange, or maybe the estrangement was forced upon them, but nonetheless, they're not talking to their one or more of their adult children. Now, that also includes stepchildren or adoptive children as well, not just children who they were born to this parent or parents. The second perspective then is the perspective of the adult children who are estranged from their parents. And again, it may be voluntary, maybe involuntary, maybe they didn't choose to estrange from the parent, maybe they did choose it. And again, it also includes step parents, it could include adoptive parents as well. And then the third perspective is sibling to sibling, when a brother or sister is forced to be estranged from one or more siblings themselves. From my experience, with the clients who come to me, the most common that I see, the perspective that I see the most, is from adult children who've chose to estrange from their parents for whatever reason. Occasionally, sibling to sibling estrangement comes in, but it's almost exclusively adult children who are looking to create a sense of freedom from the hold that their parents have over them. Again, I'm not saying that other therapists haven't dealt with the parents who are estranged from their adult children, but one thing that the research has highlighted, that there may be a greater stigma on the parents who are estranged from their adult children. Maybe they feel a greater weight of guilt or shame because this has happened, and as a result, they're not forthcoming, they're not talking about it, and maybe they're not engaging with therapy. Bear in mind that within families there's other types of estrangement. Someone could be estranged from a partner, somebody could be estranged from aunties, uncles, cousins, and that's again all part of the problem. And just from my work and from the research, they tend to be the most common perspectives that we see. So when I talk about family estrangement, there tends to be two basic natures, and that is the estrangement is either voluntary or involuntary. A voluntary estrangement is when you made the decision to create that distance from one or more family members in your family. Now, a voluntary estrangement can be mutual or non-mutual. It can be mutual in the sense that the person that you chose to estrange from agrees and they're happy with the space and they're okay with that. And then a non-mutual voluntary estrangement is when you made the decision but the other parties are not happy, they're not accepting it, and they're not comfortable with it, and maybe they're pushing back, maybe they're re-engaging with you to try and force a reconciliation, force contact, and you're just constantly trying to create that space between them for whatever reason. And then the other one is an involuntary estrangement, and that's when you someone has forced an estrangement on you, and it's not mutual because you're not happy with it, you don't understand it, you're trying to find out why, and you could be quite heartbroken over that. And I've seen that quite a bit with some of my own clients and some of my research participants quite recently. One in particular, her brother had chosen an estrangement on her, and she was devastated by this because she couldn't understand why he would pull back. Now, in this particular instance, he was punishing her because he wasn't happy with her behaviours. She didn't do anything wrong from my perspective. I think she was just expressing herself naturally, but he didn't like that. And it is important, the nature, whether it's voluntary or involuntary, it changes how we experience estrangement. It can be quite devastating for a person to be cut out of someone's life, for something that can seem quite trivial and quite insignificant. If it's voluntary, there is an element of control there. There's an element that I'm making a conscious choice. What research tells us, what I've seen with my own clients as well, is that grief is present always. In almost every scenario where estrangement is there, and it's quite hurtful. But what we've seen is that even though the estrangement may be voluntary, you may have chosen it, it doesn't mean that you're prepared for the grief. And some people, because estrangement, even though it's chosen, it's a byproduct of something quite negative and quite toxic, and it leads to a loss in the relationship, and that in itself can be lead to great levels of grief for people who have to experience this. So just because it's voluntary doesn't make it easier, but if it is involuntary, it can be more devastating, especially the early stages. So I've said this before, there are two basic types of estrangement. There's a physical and there's an emotional. Physical suggests geographical space between people. Emotional suggests a lack of open communication, a lack of affection, and just kind of unusual dynamic in the family where we're present but we're not close. There's all these psychological barriers between each other. It was important to understand that there's a scale to this as well. So the geographical distance, it may be huge. It could be someone decided to move to a different country. It could be, again, I said in the previous video, someone changing. I've heard people changing their names. It seems very extreme, but that happens. But just making sure that no one can physically touch them. And again, that could be a necessary distance for some people, especially if there's violence and extreme levels of abuse. The more distance, the better. Maybe people need that physical space to create a sense of safeness. Emotional distance, and again, there's a scale to that. It could be people see each other, maybe they are talking, and maybe there's an undercurrent, maybe there's undercurrents around language, around we're not sharing specific topics. Two, it could be deciding that you're almost living two separate lives, even though we see each other. Two people literally do not know what's happening in each other's lives because of that emotional space. And there could be profound changes happening in one person's life. There could be marriage, there could be having kids, but because of the emotional distance, this person just isn't involved. They still see each other, maybe at birthdays, Christmases, maybe where there's a family event, maybe there's a sickness and they're forced to be together, so there's still that physical closeness, but that's it. There isn't any other level of closeness there at all. So finally, we have two estrangement methods, and this is how an estrangement is instigated. And there's direct and there's indirect. So direct is when you directly tell a person, either verbally, in person, via email, via letters, that you do not want them in your life, or you want to create that space between each other. And that also includes second-hand information. So if you relay that to a person in the family who then relays it on, that can be considered a direct estrangement because they're being told directly, this is what's happened and this is what the way things are going to be in our relationship. The second one is an indirect estrangement, and that's when it's not explicitly expressed. It could be a kind of a passive effort where you're avoiding somebody, you're not talking about specific topics, and that's just kind of a shutdown in terms of communication and restricted communication. And again, that kind of suggests an emotional estrangement. The method in which an estrangement is instigated is heavily determined by the history of the relationship. So it may not be safe to tell somebody directly that we're becoming estranged, based on their reaction. If they're going to be violent, whether it's physical violence, whether it's psychological violence, where they're going to react with manipulation, where they're going to retaliate, that could lead someone to decide that it isn't safe for me to tell this person directly, and I'm just going to go ahead and create that space anyway. With my client, I always tell them to mind themselves, self-care, and choose the safest option for them, the one that is most appropriate for their scenario. And there isn't a universal scenario. Everyone's family situation is different, what they're going through is different, the problems and their reasons for creating space are very different as well. So I would encourage people to choose the method that's most appropriate to them. Um, that's it, guys. Thanks for watching the video. Again, please give it a share if it would help somebody that you know. Shoot me an email, carl@toxicescape.com, if you have any questions. If you want to stay in touch with the upcoming webinars, seminars, and online support groups I'm going to be running. Probably going to be March, April at this stage, but keep in touch and I'll let you know. So thanks a million, guys. Talk soon. Bye bye.